Hi. We enter into the incredible story in Genesis 16 of Sarai, Hagar, and Abram, and Yahweh negotiating childbirth and inheritance for Abram and Sarai. In the last video, I spent 20 minutes just exploring old and new ways of entering into the story, showing how older ways tended to denigrate Hagar and Ishmael and raise up Sarai and Abram, but more recent models using feminist and ecological and other forms look more closely at the story and see that it's much more complicated than that. In fact, as we're going to see today, based on the work of a number of the people that I showed in the last video, we'll see that in many ways this story is a great celebration of Hagar and a denigration of Sarai. And to get to that, we need to do some things. And there are a lot of things we need to do. And I was joking to my wife and ministry partner Sue that maybe I need to do another introductory video just on the issues involved in this chapter. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to jump right in. So as you see on the right side of the screen, I've broken out the chapter in two ways, into scenes, so the narrator's introduction, scene 1, scene 2, and then the short scene in scene 3 at the end, and color-coded the key words. And as we've seen throughout Genesis so far, and it's a common structural element in all of the Hebrew Bible, including in the Samuel series we're also doing here, to use key words, to use the same word a number of times in a short area to highlight that that's something important going on. And this chapter is really grounded in the repeated use of several key words all around the obvious theme of childbearing and the people that do that. So, as we see in the very beginning, the narrator describes Sarai as Abram's woman. The New RSV as wife, but as I've noted ever since the Garden of Eden story, there is no word in biblical Hebrew for wife. So, Isha is sometimes translated woman and sometimes translated as it is here in the New RSV as wife. But it doesn't have to mean wife, and Isha is simply a woman. And the way Ish is a man, and that comes out of the Garden of Eden story. So she's a woman, and she's Abram's woman, and that's the only way we know there's a wife is the possessive pronoun there, or the possessive form of the word. So she's Abram's woman, and yet she's also potential. There are two other statuses of women here: slave girl, Shivha, and at least in the New RSV it's translated slave girl a number of times, and you see throughout here all the way the number of times it's translated that way. But later in Genesis, in the New RSV, it's translated maid. When we deal with Rachel and Leah's Shipha, then they're considered maids according to the text. So we have to look more closely at what that status is. And the other one is mistress here, Gavira, and yet from the work of Ginny Brewster Boydston, we get an analysis of Gavira as queen mother. Later in the books of Kings, we see that term is used not for the consort of the king, not for the queen, but for the mother of the king. So we'll see a number of elements of that echoing into Sarai. And that will jump us right into the fact that in Hebrew, the word Sarai almost certainly means princess. Or something close to the king, the word sar, S-A-R, regularly being used for a military advisor or a military leader. It could either be the military person like a commander or like the equivalent of a secretary of defense, an advisor to the king around military issues. So sar is a common word for male military leaders, and here Sarai is a female version suggesting that she's some kind of a princess. And interestingly, she was last mentioned in chapter 12 when we saw the story of what? Abram going to Egypt, and that's of course the likely answer of where Hagar came from, although it's not mentioned there. But earlier when we saw the brief genealogy in chapter 11, let's look at that now. When we go back to chapter 11, we see Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife or woman was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. So in other words, Sarai's mother is Milcah, a name meaning queen. And the book of Jeremiah references that as Queen of Heaven. So to the extent that her mother is a queen, Milcah, notice how it is related to the Hebrew word for a king, Malach. This combination of having Sarai's name mean princess and her mother's name meaning queen raises for a scholar like Sabrina Tubal, whose book on Hagar I noted in my list last time. Here's her book, Sarah the Priestess, where she does an interesting analysis here based on the work of Noah Kramer, whose book, The Sumerians, you can see here is a foundational book all the way back to 1969 on who the Sumerians were. And she takes that, and if you'll bear with me, I'll summarize a complex ritual in just a few moments here, a ritual called the hieros gamos, which is a Greek word meaning sacred marriage. Sometimes it's been badly translated as sacred prostitution, but recent scholarship has highlighted there's nothing like prostitution involved. It's not sex work in the sense of somebody being paid to do that. What it is a ritual in Mesopotamia, first in Sumer and then later in Babylon, where there's a symbolic intercourse between the king and a priestess of the goddess Ishtar, or her predecessor Inanna, as a symbol of the king's control over the fertility of the land, both the land of the earth and of the people's bodies, to highlight that the monarchy is what maintains fertility. And so for a woman to engage in that kind of ritual intercourse with the king requires that she not be capable of becoming pregnant. And that's part of Tubal's argument around why Sarai is incapable of having children here. Because plainly, a human child of a woman and the king in this ritual would be problematic. Would that be a new prince to potential inheritance? This is not the queen that the king is having intercourse with, a ritual priestess. And so it was understood from Kramer that women were often forced to have low food intake to stop their periods from happening. In other words, a kind of anorexia, but not an eating disorder because of a problem with the woman, but a forced low calorie diet so her period would stop so that she wouldn't be able to get pregnant. And as scientists and doctors have noted, if that happens long enough, it ends the menstrual cycle altogether and renders the woman infertile. That may or may not be what happened in our story as we go back to our chapter here. But Sarai will attribute it to Yahweh, and yet the text doesn't say that at all. So that's just something about the name Sarai here in juxtaposition to the various aspects of status that she may have in relation to Hagar here. So that's just at the beginning. And of course, the statement bore him no children, not didn't bear them no children, but him no children. Because plainly, in the patriarchal climate of the time, the woman's primary role was as a childbearer. And as I noted in the last video, I want to put aside any notion that this is conforming or not conforming to ancient legal codes, whether that's the Hammurabi Code, which would have been effect roughly in the time period of the story world, but not in the time period of the audience's world, which would be roughly 1,000 years apart, which is, say, the story world in the second millennium BCE versus the story world about 600 or so, 6th century BCE in the 500s. And so there's no reason to think the Hammurabi Code would apply even in the 600s if you weren't in Babylon, but out in the desert, and neither do other legal codes. So this is not about legal codes. This is just about the situation amongst these people themselves. So she's born no children, and she had, notice the narrator is affirming that Hagar is property. She had an Egyptian slave girl, and again, noting that the word here, shifha, doesn't have to be translated slave girl, but highlighting that she's an Egyptian, whose name the narrator says is Hagar, although it's a name that Sarai will never say. And the name Hagar, although it appears Semitic, and Wenham suggests it might mean flight, but it plainly is very close, if not identical, to Hagar, with just a slightly different vowel, meaning the immigrant or the foreigner. And so in that case, not a name at all, but simply her status. And that will highlight an element of her status in relation to these other people. And so as we look at that, I want to highlight a couple of things that different of the scholars that I noted last time have shown for us. This is from Susan Piggott's chapter here, or article here, and she notes, and we'll see this as we go, many parallels between Hagar and Abraham. And she notes Abraham rather than Abram, because that's where he is in these later chapters. And I won't go through this all in detail. I'll post it for you on the webpage. But we can see a number of ways, quite a few ways here, where Hagar and Abraham are parallel in the narrative. But not only that, from a different source, this is from Dozman's piece, The Wilderness and Salvation History in the Hagar Story, a number of parallels between Hagar and Moses, which ought not to be too surprising given the Egyptian background. But of course, they're exact opposite characters in many ways, and yet Dozman shows how parallel they are in a whole series of ways. And again, I won't go over all those details now, but I'll post this here on the website. So to have Hagar paralleled with both Abraham and with Moses is hardly a criticism. It's raising her up to an incredibly high status. Another thing I'd like to look at as we start to enter into the story, curiously perhaps, this is one of 3 stories where Egyptian women interact with the biblical characters, and I don't want to call them Israelites yet because Abram and Sarai are not yet Israelites, since the very name Israel is given to their grandson Jacob by an angel. And so there are no Israelites yet. They're certainly not Jews. I'm just going to call them the biblical people here. And there's 3 of these kinds of stories, interestingly. And whether any of the authors of any of them expected readers to do what I'm doing here, we can't say. But as we have it, we can look at these as comparison and contrast stories around the 3 axes that occur in all 3 stories, of gender, of ethnicity, and of economic, or I could have put a political status and social status as well. So you see those are color-coded in those 3 ways. And in our story, we see that Abram is all the high categories. He has wealth, he's a man, and he's a relative high social status compared to the slave girl, Hagar. Sarai is a princess, but that renders her a woman in lower status, and I'll say something more about that in a minute. And then Hagar has all the negatives. But later in Genesis 39, when they're in Egypt, we see a variation on this, where Joseph is an Israelite and man, so he's of the lower status amongst the Egyptians, but he's a higher status because he's a man, but he's lower status because he's a slave. And they call him a Hebrew, which is also an othering term. Whereas Mrs. Potiphar, who's the one who wants to have Joseph sleep with her, is of high status because she's married to the right-hand person to the Pharaoh, and she's an Egyptian, so she's of the dominant culture, but she's a woman. And her man, Potiphar, her husband, is parallel in this context to Abram in this context. And she will ask him to make a decision about what to do about Joseph in the same way that Sarai asked Abram to make a decision about Hagar. And both men do the same thing, which is to throw out or throw into the dungeon the person who is offensive to the person of higher status. But in the Exodus, this is all turned inside out in a wonderful sort of way, where Moses, the Israelite baby boy of no status, is saved by Pharaoh's daughter, obviously a high status Egyptian, but a woman, and Moses' sister, a woman of low status and a woman, and of all the low categories, and the 2 of them conspire together. So Pharaoh's daughter works against her ethnic and social status to have solidarity as a fellow woman over the question of saving a baby's life, which highlights even more how terrible Sarai's decision is. Sarai could well have done what Pharaoh's daughter did and saved Moses, and if we think that's a stretch, because obviously the situation is a little different there, we could also compare it to Rachel and Leah, who both have Shipha, which again translated maid there, but there's never a question of whether Rachel and Leah will keep as their own those children. In fact, the children of all 4 women become the eponymous ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel, except for Joseph, the beloved son of the beloved wife of Rachel, in contrast to Leah. And yet Joseph is the only one who doesn't have a tribe named after him. The tribes are named after his half-Egyptian children, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so there's certainly nothing in that range of stories that suggests that the children of the non-Israelite, quote-unquote, or biblical mother is of any lesser status. In fact, they become Israelite tribal heads, despite the fact that they're born to the Shipha rather than to the Gevurah. So that really underscores that Sarai could easily have kept Ishmael and easily have kept Hagar around, and all could have been well if we've read Exodus. And it's hard for me to imagine any context in which the Exodus story is not older than the Genesis story. Plainly, we saw in chapter 15 that the audience knows the Exodus story. It's predicted in the dark, deep sleep dream vision that Yahweh gives Abram in the last chapters we saw, and that will play out in our story here. So 3 stories of this tension between gender, ethnicity, and economic or social status that play out, and our story here is just one of them. So let's continue with our story now, having looked a little bit at the context of the first verse. And so it speaks here, and this is the first time Sarai is speaking, and the first direct speech by a woman to a man in the entire book. And if you think, what about Adam and Eve? We'll recognize that they did not talk to each other. It says the woman gave the fruit to the man and he ate, and she talks to the snake, and Yahweh talks to her, but they never talk directly together. So this is the first time that a woman speaks to a man, and we're in chapter 16. And it starts negatively. You see that Yahweh has prevented me. So she blames Yahweh, and yet what does she know about Yahweh? We've not seen her have any direct relationship with Yahweh. We've only seen Abram have a direct relationship. She came out of Ur, obviously, and to the extent that she was a figurehead within the royal household there, as her name would certainly suggest that she was worshiping, or at least familiar with, the Mesopotamian gods, and no reason to think she's familiar with Yahweh. So this implies that Abram has told her something about Yahweh. Eventually, that's the reason why they've been on this crazy journey, although the text never says that he told her that. So we can only assume that she knows about Yahweh because of Abram, and she's assuming theologically that this is something Yahweh would do, has prevented her from having children. And the word's only one other time in Genesis where the narrator attributed to Yahweh's doing, but it's not around Sarai. In that case, it'll be around Rebekah. So she says to him, go into my slave girl. Literally, go please. And I've translated on this side a little more carefully. So if you want to download this, you can see a number of places where I've shifted the no RSV, including right here, to include the please there. So we could follow it there just as well, except my notes are over here. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. It is not clear what the perhaps is about. Is it about her own ambivalence? There's no question that if Abraham has sexual intercourse with Hagar and has a child, that Sarai can claim that child as her own, again, as we see from the model 2 generations later. And there's no reason to think that anything has changed in the social or cultural context that would be okay in Rachel and Leah's generation, but not okay in their grandmother's generation. So maybe it's just simply expressing her ambivalence here and their lack of patience that Yahweh would directly provide a source of childbearing for her, as will happen in just 2 chapters, although it'll take another 13 years, as we'll see. That I shall obtain children. And this is literally be built up. And we've seen that before. We looked at altars being built up, and it's only used one other time, and again in chapter 30 around Rachel and Leah, the idea of building up a woman or a family through pregnancy. Otherwise, it's for physically building things. And we can see that can relate to building a house in the same way that Yahweh will build David a house, meaning a dynasty that would be the monarchy on the throne in Jerusalem. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. And this takes us into the realm of what patriarchy meant in the ancient world. Many people sometimes have a naive assumption that patriarchy means that men give the orders and women listen. And that's true at one level, but as many feminist scholars and scholars of patriarchy, especially Gerda Lerner, whose classic book on patriarchy taught all of us, have highlighted, in the ancient world, patriarchy was often gender and spatially differentiated, which is to say, men had power in public and women had power in private. So this is a private situation. We're not told they're in the tent. That's certainly how it's pictured in art, and that's certainly the context in which we've seen them, is in a tent. So that's interior space, and that means she has the power there. Whereas in public spaces, as we'll see, like when they went to Egypt and talked to Pharaoh, Abram spoke and she was quiet. So it's not that Abram has all the power here. In this private space, he listens to her voice. And we'll see a number of times as between them that she tells him what to do and he does it. This is her context. And we'll see it with other women as well. So Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And for readers, of course, that's juxtaposing all the other elements of voice, but including the voice of Yahweh that he's been listening to. And that should suggest to us that this is not going to go well. But as readers, unless we know the story, it's not clear how exactly yet. So just to continue here, so after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, this is the first time marker we've had since they got there when he was 75. So now he's 85 and Sarai's 75. And we'll be told eventually that when Isaac's born, he's 100 and Sarai is 90. He's now a decade has gone by. So now we can see that these chapters that we've seen, the split with Lot and the war and the visions, have taken place over the course of 10 years. And Sarai, again, the narrator highlighting Abram's woman, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as a woman. And some scholars have seen that as the language like a legal transaction, like it's a formal gift. She's now yours. But it's not as simple as that. Let's look at the pairing of take and give together in Genesis, the verb lakach and the verb natan here. And I've highlighted the ones in magenta where the women are being treated as commodities here. So otherwise, we saw the woman took of the fruit and gave it, and Abram took of the herd and a calf and gave it, and sheep and oxen and bread and water. But here with Hagar the Egyptian and with the Shipha Zilpah, parallel, almost exactly parallel here, and then generically with the daughters as a collective treaty proposal between two groups of people there in chapter 34. Patriarchy certainly has the context of treating these women as commodities in this context here. But what about the consent? Obviously, Hagar has no consent. And many recent scholars, including the feminists that I noted last time, have really highlighted that. Dolores Williams from the perspective of slave women, writing as an African-American woman, and Elsa Temez writing as a Latinx woman from the perspective of the marginalized, but also many others. And as I didn't note this in the last video, but in this piece by Nicole Simopoulos, Who Was Hagar? Mistress, Divorcee, Exile, or Exploited Worker? An analysis of contemporary grassroots readings of Genesis 16 by Caucasian, Latina, and Black South African women, she really notes that each of these three groups of women, none of them formally trained, but all of them being guided by her, a biblical scholar, read the story so differently from their different perspectives. And that's part of the point of the last video, was to highlight how whether you as a listener or scholars as listeners come to the story and hear it differently, if we're open to listening to the story as it is and not having presuppositions that assume that biblical characters are right and whoever they're in arguments with are wrong. And so here, the idea that Hagar has no consent is something that the Me Too movement, as well as groups like those Black South African women and the Latinx women, can see and hear clearly, and scholars are also coming to see clearly now that they're not all white men. And so that's happened. And he went into Hagar and she conceived. And it happens in almost no verses here, in no words at all. Just this simple phrase in Hebrew after all the agony, and just like that. And we see the key word conceived here used several times in this little section. And then the word of most controversy here. When she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. That's one way to read it. Let's look at some other ways to read it. And I won't read through all these. You can read through them. And again, as always, I'll post it on the webpage. But such an incredibly wide diversity of translations, and almost all of them make Hagar sound worse than she is. Literally, the phrase, as we can see it from the Hebrew here below, is her mistress became small in her eyes. And so even as Westerman, who's not necessarily sympathetic to Hagar, says it's too strong to say she behaved insolently. But she noted her increased status. In other words, there could be no despising or contempt or any of that involved. It could simply be, my status is higher now that I'm pregnant. And that would certainly be the case. So it could be just simply a neutral observation that Sarai is the one who's upset about. So in other words, it's not that Hagar is looking down on Sarai, it's that she's looking at her more like an equal, and Sarai will not be treated as an equal by this Egyptian slave girl. And so that's where the story will go next time, as we see her response demanding that Abram correct the wrong that's been done to her. We will continue with that next time. See you then.